Almost immediately after Norway and Denmark fell to the German Reich, Heinrich Himmler saw a way to fix his manpower problem and a way to grow the SS. He immediately set to work recruiting the Nordics, who he saw as fellow Aryans, into the new SS Viking division, and he found plenty of takers, with anti-communist sentiment being rife up north ever since the Winter War. Swedes, Finns, Danes, Norwegians, Icelanders, and even a man from the Faroe Islands turned up to pledge loyalty to Adolf Hitler in his inevitable crusade against the Soviet Union. There was issues to be ironed out before the time came, and more recruits had to be found from somewhere else, but from early 1940, the wheels were put in motion for what would become the most famous division of the war. Before we begin, this video is part of a mini-series covering mainly the SS Viking division, but also other Scandinavian volunteers during the war. You can just as easily view this video individually, however, if you want to learn about their actions all throughout Operation Barbarossa. Also, as my regular viewers know, I am moving away soon to pursue YouTube full-time, and without the support of my patrons, who are saving my ass right now, I wouldn't be able to do so, and I can't thank them enough. So if you do enjoy the channel, and have a few spare dollars laying around each month, please do consider signing up in the link in the description. Thank you. All throughout the interwar years, the Scandinavians had completely neglected their militaries and had adopted the neutrality approach. Obviously for those who had grown up during this time, who had now joined the Waffen-SS, the transition was intense and immediate. One Norwegian recruit, called Ole Brunes, states, quote, "The training was of course no Sunday school. Our German instructors were no real deep psychologists, but like us, ordinary healthy German youth from all parts of the people and from all professions. They had self-confidence, were well-skilled with a dynamic efficiency, and were remarkably proud of their famous German military traditions. We Norwegians, coming from a country where national defence had been neglected, the military professions ridiculed, and any tradition nearly ruined, had a lesson to learn with regard to accuracy, toughness, discipline, and cleanliness, physically as well as morally. Fingernails being examined before eating, the locking of wardrobes strictly forbidden, thefts from comrades punished hard." End quote. Most of this training ended up taking place in occupied Poland or France, as the space for the Waffen-SS simply did not exist in Germany at the time, and the priorities understandably laid elsewhere, given that the nation was not at war with the USSR just yet. Overall, the general consensus from accounts is that the training was tough but fair, and in general, most men liked their commanding officers. Bjorn Ostring said, quote, "The training was hard, and our German instructors used their own language. Some of them we liked, others not. My company commander said, 'When you go into action, it will be easier than being here.' And he was right." End quote. The official reports back to Berlin describe the Scandinavians as, quote, "independently minded and strongly inclined to criticism." Tensions between the Germans and their new Scandinavian volunteers was fairly minimal, although there was cases of such things popping up where a few Germans felt themselves superior to the newcomers, but this was rare. Erik Brorup, a Danish volunteer, said, quote, "I wasn't personally subjected to any form of demeaning or degrading treatment because I was a Dane. I went through the officers' school where there was respect for every individual, not like the usual senseless nonsense you normally find, the US Military Academy at West Point being a case in point. An absolute no-no was to curse or call anyone by insulting names and the like. The honour and dignity of any man, officer, or other rank was not to be violated. This had a lot to do with the great sense of comradeship which was instilled into the Waffen-SS. A mutual respect existed. Many commanders radiated a certain charisma, and their troops would follow them to hell and back." End quote. From December 1940, Hitler saw that an invasion of the Soviet Union was becoming unavoidable. The British were clamouring for the Soviets to invade Germany at an opportune moment, and the border itself was absolutely riddled with tension. Thus, Operation Barbarossa was fought up and plans laid out. These plans included Hitler's Scandinavians. On the 13th of February 1941, the Nordland was opened up to Finnish volunteers, and whilst the numbers were not mind-blowing, each man was perhaps worth a dozen, as all of them were not only combat veterans, but combat veterans against the Soviets. 116 of these men arrived on the second week of May and were sent straight to the Viking. Over the next few months, Hundreds more arrived, and in the end, the Germans were so pleased with recruitment from their new ally, Finland, that the Finnish Volunteer Battalion of the Waffen SS was created. The Finnish government's only demands were that ethnic Swedes, 15% of the Finnish population, not be the predominant part of the battalion, and that Finnish officers and NCOs use their own native language to command their troops. The Germans were more than happy to oblige. The overall battalion commander, however, was a German named Hans Kalani, who would go on to command the Finnish SS until his death later in the war. Before the war, he was a merchant seaman in the Baltic and was familiar with all things Scandinavian. To top things off, he had no notions of German supremacy, and so as a result, him and his men would get on brilliantly. The Finnish Volunteer Battalion didn't see combat until early 1942, however, and the Viking would have to set off on their crusade against communism without them. Overall, though, recruitment in the build-up to Barbarossa was pretty lackluster, and even a radio address by Quisling himself in Norway, publicly calling for thousands of volunteers, only pulled in a few hundred recruits. Regardless, the 19,021-man-strong SS Viking, although not exclusively filled with Scandinavians, was the biggest formation in the Waffen SS, and they set off to Army Group A in the south. The Viking didn't go into action on the 22nd of June 1941, the day of the invasion, but a week later, on the 29th. The Viking marched right into the Soviets defending the city of Lvov. The fighting was vicious, however the recon battalion arrived with their armoured cars and won the day for the Viking. The city was then renamed Lemberg, as it was called in the Austro-Hungarian days. The Viking pushed on, and soon a river crossing was forced, led by the Westland. The fighting was a confused mess, and a 6-man recon patrol ended up coming under attack, and after the hand-to-hand fighting that followed, the entire patrol was killed. 3 were Germans, 2 were Dutchmen, and 1 was a Dane named Gunnar Christiansen, the first Dane to die in the war. The second perished a few weeks later when the skies began to open up and the Viking were pinned down. They fought bitterly, held their ground, and then counterattacked, but regardless, Heinrich Hewson became the second Dane to die on August the 2nd. Whilst the Viking hadn't really played a starring role so far, overall, the invasion was going according to plan, and the Red Army was being absolutely decimated by the gigantic German invasion force. In the south, von Rundstedt decided to head for the railway junction at the city of Uman. In Ukraine, the road network was pitiful, so the railways were the key to any success. The first gigantic encirclement battle of 1941 began, and panzers streamed south and east into space at full speed. Boudinot, the Soviet commander, was completely outwitted and ended up grasping at shadows, unable to deal with the situation. Encirclements aren't easy to pull off, however, as the panzers could easily be cut off if other units weren't quick to pounce on the prey in the trap. The Viking was nearby and was sent in to help in these operations to close the pocket. The Red Army soldiers desperately tried to escape, launching attack after attack, but the Vikings stood firm, and by August the 10th it was all over, and 107,000 Red Army soldiers marched off into captivity. Then, Hitler halted Army Group Center's drive on Moscow and aimed itself towards Kiev instead to finish the job. The largest military victory of all time up to that point then ensued, with a staggering 665,000 Soviet soldiers being captured, along with almost 900 tanks. Following this colossal victory, the Viking then continued eastwards across Ukraine to cross the Dnieper. In the last days of August, they did just that and crossed the river, holding a tiny bridgehead which the Soviets tried desperately to wipe out. A Nordland veteran recalled, "Every morning the Russians rushed the bridgehead and tried to crush it. A weight of artillery fire, never before experienced, rained down on the defenders' positions. They fought bitterly, refusing to yield a metre of ground. In these days, the Germans, Danes, Norwegians and Finns grew together into an exemplary combat team. Morning after morning with great bravery, they fought off repeated Russian assaults. They were recognised by their Wehrmacht commanders as the bridgehead's strongest supporting pillar in the uneven battle. The Soviets tried everything, even trying to flood them out by destroying a giant hydroelectric dam nearby, but ultimately nothing worked, and on the 6th of September, the Westland and Germania regiments stormed across the river to save their besieged comrades of the Nordland. In the fighting, 8 entire Russian divisions were annihilated, and over 5,000 men surrendered. Felix Steiner, the division's commander, wrote the order of the day saying, quote, "The division has become a symbol for the firm bonds uniting all the volunteers within its ranks, whether of German, Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, or Finnish nationality. Division Viking is for all an expression of our unity and common fate, and we are worthy to take our place in the history of German soldiery." End quote. Now it was time for a journey of over 300 miles as the Viking pushed onto the Don River. The weather once again was not in the division's favour, however, and the next fortnight was spent slogging through the mud as engines broke down and vehicles sank into the sludge. By early November, though, the city of Rostov-on-Don was in sight, and the men from up north now found themselves in the land of the Cossacks. A Nordland veteran recounted their first encounter with these steppe people. Quote, "I happened quite by chance to look towards the range of hills 2 to 3 kilometers north of our position. At first, I could not believe my eyes. In the name of heaven, what is that? A closed front of horsemen burst out of the hills and stormed towards us. I nudged Untersturmführer Lindner, who called, 'Alarm, Cossacks!' For a few seconds, everyone was paralyzed. Seconds seemed like an eternity, but then the spell was broken. Lindner and I each ran to a gun, and finally, the first shots roared out in direct fire. Meanwhile, both of the anti-aircraft vehicles' machine guns began to hammer. The range decreased 700, 600, 500 meters. Now all guns were firing. A terrible sight. Horses and riders plunged to the ground. Yet the cavalcade continues to storm ceaselessly towards us. By the time they are 100 meters away, the attack has become so decimated that it no longer poses a serious danger. Still, some 70 to 80 Cossacks reach our firing positions, swinging their Cossack sabres above their heads. The majority break through and disappear beyond the next hill. The rest have fallen in battle. We are still quite numbed when the apparition has passed. Of approximately 600 Cossacks, more than 300 lay dead on the battlefield. Interrogation of the survivors revealed that the Russian commander thought that the troops in front of him were his own. By the time he recognized them as Germans, it was too late to turn around, so he decided to try and ride over us." End quote. The Viking carried on still further east, but by now, Operation Barbarossa was reaching its end. Every mile further the men marched meant another mile to add to the ridiculously long supply lines, whilst the Soviets got shorter. Vehicles were being lost by the hundreds, and those that remained were essentially held together by string. There did not appear to be a feasible way to continue on quickly in such conditions. The temperature began to plummet, and the beginning of the coldest Russian winter in a century began to set in. The only benefit that came from this was that the cold hardened the roads so that the Vikings' vehicles could get moving again. Hitler refused to allow his men to stop, and insisted that through sheer willpower, his millions of soldiers continue on and deliver the final blow to the Soviet army, which was on the brink of collapse. Honouring their oath to Adolf Hitler, the Viking carried on against all logic into the Russian abyss. Counterattack after counterattack came their way, and the men simply could not believe their eyes. How could there still be so much resistance when the Russians had already suffered such mind-blowing losses? Although it was clear that no victories the size of Kiev would be won again anytime soon, the endless counterattacks did not stop the important city of Rostov from falling, along with 10,000 Red Army prisoners. North of the city, the Nordics reached the river Tuslo, but by this time they were understandably at the end of their tether, and they couldn't hold it. Steiner accepted the inevitable and pulled his frostbitten men back before things got too bad. For his men's heroic efforts, von Scholtz was awarded the Knight's Cross. His citation, written by Felix Steiner, is a page long and glowingly reports the actions of the Viking in conducting an orderly retreat against overwhelming odds. Part of it read, "The feat of the battle group of SS Oberfuhrer von Scholtz to resist the attacks of such a hugely superior force for 4 days would have been unthinkable without the personal intervention of von Scholtz. He stayed day and night in the most dangerous positions. On November the 18th, he led the combat in Dobropolj with his own weapon in hand, against massive attacks, while enemy tanks broke through the infantry positions to his rear. He was standing in the front line when his 3rd Battalion met the furious attacks of the Caucasian 99th and 325th Divisions in the east, in the village of Tuslo. The tanks could not be stopped, and they drove into the village, but the Russian infantry could not overcome the men of the SS Regiment Nordland." End quote. The men then dug in and waited for the winter to pass in their snow-covered bunkers. It became abundantly clear that the war was not going to be won as quickly as many had imagined, and doubts began to creep into the minds of many. When 1942 rolled around, they would have to fight again and try their luck, but this time, surprise wasn't on their side. By year's end, The Danes had lost 65 of their original 216 men, and the division was still pretty small in terms of actual Scandinavian volunteers. There was 291 Norwegians, 251 Danes, and 8 Swedes, which was around the same number that they had started with, although the new recruits were not quite up to par with the original men, according to von Scholz. These few hundred men's heroics on the Eastern Front had made waves back home, however, and the recruitment centres in Oslo and Copenhagen were swarmed with eager recruits, although most of these men were looking to join the new national legions and not the Viking itself. This phenomenon wasn't only taking place in Scandinavia, and had begun almost immediately once Barbarossa kicked off. All over Europe, willing recruits were making themselves known. The far-right parties, and their already radicalised youth wings especially, flocked to sign up to fight communism however they could. The Viking wasn't really benefiting from such enthusiasm, however, as most wanted to fight for their own nations with Nazi Germany, as opposed to for Nazi Germany. The solution that naturally appeared from several collaborationist leaders was the creation of national legions. The SS took responsibility for the so-called Aryan nations, such as Norway, Denmark, the Flemish and Dutch legions, and the army took responsibility for the rest, like the French, the Walloons, the Croatians, and the Spanish. On the very same day that the Viking was getting its first taste of combat in Ukraine in June, the Den Norsk Legion was announced by Reich Commissar Joseph Terboven back in Norway. Quisling, putting his differences with Terboven aside, decided to publicly support the new formation and urged his fellow Norwegians to sign up. One of those Norwegians who answered the call was Bjarne Dramstad, who said, quote, "Quisling proclaimed that this was to be the base of the new Norwegian army, and it was going to defend Finland. My brother Rolf thought this was a good idea. He did not join. He had done his share in the Winter War, but now it was my turn." End quote. A recruiting rally was held in Oslo on the 4th of July, and 400 of the 1,500 men of the pre-war officer corps expressed an interest, as well as many men from the Herd paramilitary wing of Quisling's National Gathering Party. The DNL appeared promising at first, and unlike the Viking, it was almost entirely Norwegian. The only non-Norwegians were German advisors with no real authority. Regardless though, things quickly turned sour, as it turned out that the Legion was not the Norwegian army formation that many had hoped, but simply a formal part of the Waffen-SS. Their uniforms were German, albeit with a Norwegian flag on their shoulder. Another issue that arose almost immediately was where they would actually be fighting. Many were eager to join the continuation war and fight alongside their Finnish cousins, but instead they were sent to Leningrad to fight on the German side of the front. Dramstad remembered, quote, "We were transferred to the front in Ju-52s, and it was just before the planes took off that we were told that the destination was Leningrad and not Finland. I remember we were furious, but it was accepted. We were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders, but many of us felt betrayed by the Germans." End quote. To top it off, the Legion was viewed more as a propaganda asset than anything else, because many thought the war would be over quickly. As a result, the men ended up with second-hand weapons from captured stocks, and the initial enthusiasm from the Norwegians evaporated. Many, including the DNL's first commander, simply left as soon as their initial 3-month term was up. His replacement lasted just 2 weeks, and he too also quit in disgust of German interference. The Legion quickly fell into disarray, but luckily for them, a leader was found to steady the ship. That man was Arthur Kvist, a middle-aged ex-Norwegian army cavalry captain who was close friends with Quisling. Finally, in February 1942, after ironing out some of the initial problems, most prominent among them training, they were taken to the front and took up their positions outside Leningrad for the first time. The Norwegians were not the only legions, of course, and their southern neighbour, Denmark, had a similar story. In July 1941, the Danish government, which was of course still acting as it had before the war, albeit with German troops using their military installations, announced the creation of the Freikorps Danmark, or the Danish Free Corps in English. The name Free was used as opposed to Legion, as the Germans were trying to project an image of Danish independence to the world, as their occupation was a very different story to all the other nations currently with German troops within their borders. Royal Danish army troops were allowed to enlist with their state pension rights kept intact, and their rank being kept the same if applicable. The initial draft brought in 480 men, some of whom were Swedes who made their way down south. The king and the government appealed to their subjects to sign up, and in the end, many were swayed by this message. Many conservative Danish army officers signed up and fought with distinction. The man who was chosen to lead was artillery officer Lieutenant Colonel Christian Peder Kreising. Christian was no National Socialist, but rather a deeply conservative Danish nationalist who wanted to protect his nation from the horrors of communism after seeing what happened to the Finns. On July the 5th, 2 days after taking command of the Free Corps, he made a public appeal for support. Quote, "Men of Denmark, with the approval of the government, I have been placed in command of the Free Corps Denmark. This corps will fight against the Bolshevik world enemy, who has several times endangered the security of the North, and thereby the freedom and way of life of our homeland. Men of Denmark, I call upon you to join the ranks of the Free Corps Denmark, so that we can make a combined contribution against Bolshevism. For the honour of Denmark, for the liberty of our people, and for the future of our native land, we are united in the brotherhood of arms with those nations that have already entered the fight against the enemy of Europe, and consequently of our homeland." End quote. His appointment didn't last long, however, and his anti-Nazi views didn't go down well with the men, who were mostly on board to join Hitler's struggle. Widespread anger broke out, and graffiti began to appear on the barrack walls calling for his removal. Things continued down this path, and on the 8th of February, the concerned Germans removed him, as well as many of his fellow officers. He went on to prove himself in the war regardless, however, and was the first non-German to attain general rank in the Wehrmacht, but in the end the Free Corps just wasn't a good fit for him. His replacement was Christian Frederick von Schallberg. Christian was born to a Danish father and aristocratic Russian mother in the Russian Empire, but fled when the communists took power. Christian married into the German nobility, and he was no conservative. He was a full-blown National Socialist. His pre-war public speeches and youth marches were too much for his superiors, and they demanded his resignation. When the Winter War kicked off, he became one of the commanders in the Danish battalion, and then when he returned home, he joined the Viking on their march into the Soviet Union, where he won both classes of the Iron Cross for leading his men from the front. A proven and respected man, Christian instantly was a great fit for the Free Corps, and he was respected by both National Socialists and Conservatives alike, and the issues began to be ironed out. And so, despite their initial hiccups, the legions were ready for 1942 and the horrors that followed. Enthusiasm was high, and despite a growing collection of doubters, most still felt the war could be over soon, but their dramatic story, once they marched into the Great Eastern Abyss, is for the next episode. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy, please press like and leave a comment. It helps a lot in the algorithm. As usual, I'll leave you by thanking my patrons who are keeping me afloat. Once again, even the $2 tier helps massively if you enjoy these videos, want to join our Discord, or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games. Thank you. Thank you to Lobster to You, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Berglund, Levi E, Lanza, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, Wunderwaffe, Mr. Bloom, Gav D, John Higgins, JD, Green Rebel, Angus Roxburgh, Rucksacker Too Heavy, Alexios Podcast Watcher, and finally, Inflection Point from Subscribe Star.